This is our ongoing discussion of Simondon's Individuation in light of notions of form and information. We're on part 3 on psychic individuation, and we're just going to be beginning chapter 2, individuation and affectivity. To recap, last time we looked at some ideas about information. That was the sort of key topic of last week's reading, I think. Simondon has his own specific meaning of the term information that we've seen a couple of times. He contrasts this with the standard notion of information from communication theory, which is a quantitative notion of information, according to which a message carries more information the less predictable it is. Simondon sort of wants to contrast this notion of information with the notion of form in Gestalt psychology, which is conversely is a notion according to which something has a good form, the more predictable it is, or the more it sort of accords with the principles of good form. So something like a square or a triangle or a circle, these simple geometrical figures are the basic forms of good forms in Gestalt psychology. Simondon wants to develop this notion of information that is sort of that would mediate between this quantity of information concept from communication theory and the concept of a good form from Gestalt psychology. So it would be something that it's not minimally predictable like a message in communication theory, and it's not maximally predictable like a good form. It has this sort of intermediate value. And he uses different terms for this. He sometimes calls it a tension of information, but it has to do with the generation of forms or the genesis of forms rather than just a reception of forms. And so Simondon argues that we will tend to find this genesis of forms or the creation of new forms only in situations with an affective charge or an emotional charge. So this is sort of why in a laboratory setting where you just have a psych student, pressing a button every time there's a triangle or some other simple task like that, in that setting, you don't have a real genesis of forms. So he looks at instead situations like a child seeing a certain kind of animal for the first time. So there's some sort of emotional reaction of the child, and the child is able to grasp the form of the animal and understand which part is the head and which part is the tail and so on without necessarily knowing anything about this type of animal. And then we saw, so again, there's more discussion of the storing of information, which is similarly quantitative. Storing light information in a photograph, for example, requires a certain density of elements that are capable of being affected by light. So the more grains there are in a photographic film, the more independent decisions there are for storing information. But then this is not exactly, so this notion of storing information is not the same as the notion of an intensity of information or what he also calls tension of information in other places. So this notion of intensity of information has to do with the vital individuation of the subject. So it's only insofar as the subject is a living being that they are capable of receiving information in the specific sense that Simondon gives to that term. And then we have the last little bit of the paragraph of the section. He talks about this intensity. So he talks about this intensity and the way that it works sort of independently from perceptual clarity or fineness of grain or anything like that. So something like a smell can be very evocative of emotional responses, even if it doesn't have any sort of precise figure in the way that visual perception does. So we can think of an example like smelling someone's perfume or smelling a type of food. These will tend to evoke some sort of emotional response, even though the actual perception itself is pretty vague and hard to pin down. And then there's this comparison in the last little bit, the last paragraph, this comparison of the synthesis of concepts with crystallization, which is a bit obscure. It's not one of the clearer passages of this section that we've been reading, but the idea is that the formation of a concept is not just something like abstraction from perceived objects. So the sort of traditional notion of concept formation is just that you see a dog on Monday, you see a dog on Tuesday, you see another dog on Wednesday, etc. And then after seeing different dogs, you abstract from the individual dogs, and you preserve what's common to them, and that creates your concept of a dog. So Simondon argues that concept formation is actually a form of individuation. So it's not just you're not just abstracting away from what's common to the different perceived objects, but instead you are undergoing a process of individuation. This is something that we can see at work in the case of metaphysical systems or metaphysical doctrines, where the whole introducing a new concept reorganizes the whole system of concepts so that you have to think in a completely different way than you did before this new metaphysical system has been assimilated. And so concept formation is like perception in the sense that it involves this emotional or affective aspect or resonance. So yeah, let's start in on this section. Okay. So let's get started. I'll read the first page or so, and then we'll go around from there. Okay, so chapter 2, Individuation and Affectivity, subsection 1, Consciousness and Individuation, the quantum nature of consciousness. Such a study requires us to pose the problem of the rapport between consciousness and the individual. This problem seems to have been obscured above all by the fact that Gestalt theory has privileged the perceptive relation over the active relation and the affective relation. If equilibrium is restored by reintroducing the consideration of all the aspects of relation, it becomes clear that the subject effectuates the separation of units in the world object of perception, which is a support for action or response to sensible qualities, insofar as this subject realizes within itself a progressive individualization through successive leaps. This role of consciousness in individuation has been poorly defined because the psyche has been considered as an undefined plurality in the atomistic doctrine, or as a pure, indissoluble, and continuous unity in the doctrines opposed to atomistic psychology, whether this be Bergsonism or Gestalt theory in its beginnings. In fact, if it is supposed that the individuality of states of consciousness, of acts of consciousness, and of qualities of consciousness is that of a quantum type, it is possible to discover a mediation between absolute unity and infinite plurality. A regime of intermediary causality thereby appears between the obscured determinism that results in the psyche as stripped of interiority and consistency, and the tensed and limpid finality that allows for neither exteriority nor accident. The psyche is neither pure interiority nor pure exteriority, but an ongoing differentiation and integration according to a regime of associated causality and finality that we shall call transduction, a regime that seems to us to be a process that is more fundamental than causality and finality, which express the borderline cases of a fundamental process. The individual individuates insofar as it perceives beings, constitutes an individuation through action or through a productive construction, and belongs to the system that includes its individual reality and the objects that it perceives or constitutes. Consciousness would thus become a mixed regime of causality and efficiency, insofar as it links the individual to itself and to the world. Affectivity and emotivity would thus be the transductive form of the psyche par excellence, the intermediary between the clear consciousness and subconsciousness, a continual link of the individual to itself and to the world, or rather the link between the relation of the individual to itself and the link of the individual to the world. At the level of affectivity and emotivity, the relation of causality and the relation of finality are not opposed. Every affectivo emotive moment is simultaneously judgment and preformed action. It is really bipolar in its unity. Its reality is that of a relation that has a value of autoposition with respect to its terms. Affectivo-emotive polarization feeds on itself insofar as it includes or is a result of an intentionality. It is at once autoposition and heteroposition. Thus, the individual would be neither a pure relation of exteriority nor an absolute substantiality. It could not be identified with the residue of the analysis that fails when confronted with the indivisible, or with the first principle that contains everything in its unity, from whence everything flows. Okay, so this is a pretty dense passage. Yeah, heavy lifting for sure. So some of this is going to be explained a bit more as we go along. Some of it is not. So we have to sort of decipher what's going on just from this passage. But so to start with, he's again trying to find an intermediate position or an alternate position between something like psychological atomism, so an empiricist doctrine according to which psychological phenomena would be composed of psychological atoms that are joined together through some sort of process of association. And then on the other hand, Gestalt psychology, or he counts Bergson on this side as well, as some sort of theory that a holistic theory or a theory of psychological holism, according to which the mind or the psyche is a sort of indivisible whole, and individual psychological phenomena would be sort of abstractions out of that whole. So he wants to find something that's intermediate between those two, and this is a sort of standard move for Bergson, for Simondon, to take an opposition between positions and try to find the middle ground, not in the sense of like trying to reconcile the two positions, but taking those two positions as like extreme points of a continuum and trying to isolate that middle portion of the continuum and find a philosophical position that is adequate for that middle portion rather than just for the two extremes. And so there's this notion here of a quantum property of consciousness, or quantum nature of consciousness. And so here he's not specifically talking about quantum physics, but he means the quantum nature of consciousness here means the threshold effect, or the fact that consciousness is structured by threshold effects. So he's going to clarify this a bit later, but he talks about processes of individuation that are sort of discrete or self-contained processes. So there's like one process of individuation that takes place, and then there's another one that takes place. So it's sort of an abrupt process of switch from one. Or sorry, there's sort of an abrupt switch from one process of individuation to another one. So it's not just one continuous stream of consciousness. There's distinct processes of individuation going on in consciousness. And then he expresses this in terms of transduction. So this is again that middle ground or intermediate form within the psyche. So transduction in general has to do with some sort of process of structuring of something that is previously unstructured through a gradual transmission of structure. And so we can think here of the crystal example that he introduces in the physical individuation part. So in the same way that the solution crystallizes gradually across, so that each layer crystallizes the layer that follows it. In the same way, there's this sort of gradual transition between what he calls here causality and efficiency. So, causality and finality. In the case of, so causality would correspond to psychological atomism. So there would be causal relationships between ideas that would make up the mind. And then finality corresponds to psychological holism, so that everything within the mind would be, in some sense, directed by the final cause, which is the mind as a whole. And so this transduction would be some sort of intermediate between these two, or some mediation between the two. And then he goes on. There's a sort of abrupt transition, but he points to the role of affectivity and emotivity as being the transductive form of the psyche, so that if we regard perception and action as sort of two ends of the spectrum, then affectivity is what is the intermediate point in the spectrum. It's that transductive point in the spectrum, or portion of the spectrum. And right, so there's right, and a question in the chat about transduction. So is it something like a precipitous accruing aggregation? I think precipitous might not be the right word, but accruing or aggregation is a good translation. So yeah, it's there's always transduction is always a gradual process of structuring something that was previously unstructured. So yeah, I think it's sorry, what was I going to say? I think Simondon understands transduction primarily in terms of the example of crystallization, rather than through a sort of formal definition. So I think that crystallization example is something we can always keep in mind. So when he describes something as transductive, he's sort of comparing it to the example of crystallization. Yeah, so I think that is most of the main concepts that are introduced in this this passage. But yeah, so let's go on to the next subsection. If someone else would like to read the next, yeah, the whole subsection is about a page and a half. So maybe if someone could read subsection 2.
I can read if you want.
Sure, go ahead.
2. Signification of effective subconsciousness. The intimacy of the individual should not be sought at the level of pure consciousness or that of organic unconsciousness. It should be sought at the level of effectivo-emotive subconsciousness. In this sense, the thesis that we are presenting here would diverge from the doctrine that is broadly called psychoanalysis. Psychoanalysis has noted that there is indeed an unconscious in the individual, but it considered this unconscious as a complete psyche that is somewhat copied from a consciousness that can be grasped. On the contrary, we shall suppose that there is a fundamental layer of the unconscious that is the subject's capacity for action. The sequences of action can hardly be grasped by clear consciousness. The subject errs to the greatest extent with respect to what it wants or wills, and does not want or will. The succession of acts of will ensues in such a way that the markers of the process appearing to consciousness is quite rare and in no way suffices to constitute a valid foundation. By contrast, representation is much clearer. The unconscious representative elements are not rare but summary, barely sketched out, and generally incapable of veritable invention and progress. They remain fairly crude stereotypes that lack representative reality. At the limit between consciousness and the unconscious, on the contrary, there is the layer of subconsciousness, which is essentially affectivity and emotivity. This relational layer constitutes the center of individuality. The modifications of this layer are the modifications of the individual. Affectivity and emotivity are capable of quantum reorganizations. They proceed through abrupt leaps according to degrees and obey a law of thresholds. They are the relation between the continuous and the pure discontinuous, between consciousness and action. Without affectivity and emotivity, consciousness seems like an epiphenomenon, and action seems like a discontinuous series of consequences without premises. An analysis of what can be called psychical individuality, should therefore be centered on affectivity and emotivity. Here as well, psychoanalysis acted appropriately, although without always using a theory that is adequate to its operative appropriateness. Because when the psychoanalyst addresses the individual, he is acting within the affectivo-emotive regime. What Jung discovers in his analysis of the unconscious or the subconscious are the affectivo-emotive themes at the basis of myths. If one can speak in a certain sense of the individuality of a group or of a people, it is not by virtue of a community of action, which is too discontinuous and cannot be a solid basis, nor by virtue of an identity of conscious representations, which are too broad and too continuous to allow for the segregation of groups. Collective groupings are constituted at the level of affectivo-emotive themes, which are a mixture of representation and action. Inter-individual participation is possible when affectivo-emotive expressions are the same. Thus, the vehicles of this affective community are not merely symbolic elements, but also effective elements of the life of groups, the regime of sanctions and rewards, symbols, the arts, and collectively esteemed and unappreciated objects. Finally, it can be noted that this doctrine, which places the quantum regime of affectivity and emotivity at the center of the individual, is in agreement with the teaching of research on the structure and genesis of species and organisms. No living being seems to be deprived of affectivo-emotivity, which has a quantum nature for highly complex beings such as humans and also for beings that are only partially organized. The oldest layers of the nervous system, particularly the midbrain, are the centers of this regulation. Pathology also shows that the dissolution of individuality can occur quite profoundly when the organic foundations of this regulation are affected, particularly in the case of tumors of the midbrain, wherein it seems that the very foundations of the personality are destabilized. Whereas a weakening of the functions of representative consciousness or of the capacities of action alters the personality without destroying it, and often in a reversible manner, alterations to affectivity and emotivity are rarely reversible.
Thanks. So we have another pretty dense passage here, but he does explain a couple of notions that he introduced in the last passage. So that notion of quantum nature of consciousness, you can see at the bottom of 274, he says when he's defining the quantum nature of affectivity and emotivity, he says they proceed through abrupt leaps according to degrees and obey laws of thresholds. And so that's the sort of quasi definition of the quantum nature of consciousness. So this idea of abrupt leaps is what he has in mind, rather than some sort of continuity of consciousness. But here, so we have this contrast with psychoanalysis, and it seems like what he's thinking of when he talks about psychoanalysis here is actually more Jung than Freud, and he mentions Jung in the next paragraph. But it seems to be that what he's talking about is something like the collective unconscious that Jung talks about, as opposed to specifically the unconscious as Freud conceives it. And so he's going to make a distinction here between not just conscious and unconscious, but a three-way distinction between conscious, subconscious, and unconscious. And it's that subconscious layer or level that he wants to go into in more detail or focus on. And so this subconscious level is the one that he describes as affectivo-emotive. So it's the layer of our reactions towards phenomena in the sense of either seeing them as good or bad or valuable or unvaluable or something like that. And so he points out that this this layer is sort of forms the capacity for action. So whenever we act, we're always sort of implicitly working with some sort of valuation. So if we, pick up one brand of ice cream at the store as opposed to another one, we're sort of implicitly selecting that brand as being better than the other one. So any action by making some sort of decision or choosing one alternative over another, you're sort of implicitly acting in light of a evaluation of those different options. And Simondon points out that this valuation is something that we in general are not aware of. So you might, if someone asks you what's your favorite, I don't know, we can stick with the ice cream example, what's your favorite kind of ice cream? You might say one thing, but then when you go to the store, you actually pick up something different. So you, if you stick with what the subject actually says about themselves, you will have like an incomplete and a distorted picture of what they actually value. And you can see this in more I guess significant decision making. So someone might say that they care a lot about X, but then their actions show that they are really not acting as if they care about X. So that layer of the affective is something that we're not directly aware of, or insofar as we're aware of it, we don't have some sort of infallible access to this layer of the affective.
The all the midbrain stuff brought back memories of Jane's and bicameral mind theory.
Yeah, that's something that I am only sort of vaguely aware of, but that weird notion of like the idea that the human brain was sort of constituted of these two, or I guess it's the two hemispheres that were sort of disjoined from each other until sometime in like 5000 BC or something like that is when I think he says that the sort of joining together happened. Is that right?
Oh, I don't remember. I think that there's a lot that kind of went wrong with the theory. It kind of was taken. I mean, I guess I've read a lot of criticism of it that was like, I mean, I think it almost is kind of like arbitrary what historical period he kind of picked out, but I think it was supposed to be whatever like period was related to the development of the certain kind of technical capacities that humans had. So that but I think what's more interesting about James though, and it relates more to the psychoanalytic theme here, that the kind of Jungian section, because it's more about kind of the bicamerality as a theory of like the development of the kind of bipolar or two-poled aspects of like mythological construction. So there's a lot of interesting stuff there beyond kind of the stuff which perhaps might be historically spurious or neurologically spurious, I guess, at this point.
Okay, yeah, that's interesting. I wasn't aware of that other aspect of his work. I only sort of knew vaguely about his sort of weird historical idea about like this neurological transformation of human beings in historical time. And then there's a question in the chat here from Pretzel. So could the subconscious layer be better handled currently within the register of neuroscience in terms of processes rather than this quantum notion? I'm not sure. I mean, definitely there would be a lot more information available about how how the brain is involved in something like affective processes. But I think this quantum character as something that he would probably, that Simondon, if he could, time travel and look at 21st century neuroscience and sort of adapt his theory accordingly, I think he would still want to keep something like this quantum character, in the sense that even at the level of individual neurons, there's still this threshold effect. So you have like a neuron can only fire or not fire. It doesn't have sort of degrees in that sense. And so what happens with a lot of neurological processes is that you have inputs that get summed or combined in some way, and then if they go over a certain threshold, then the neuron will fire. And then that gets incorporated into another level that does a similar type of summation over different inputs, and then so you have these multiple layers of summation. So I think Simondon would argue that there's still this quantum character, or this threshold nature of neurological processes as well, and so yeah, I think on the other hand, I would say also that there's what he's describing is a psychological phenomenon. So he's describing the sort of experience of affectivity, rather than specifically the neurological basis on which it works. So he's describing he's describing the experience, and so we would have to evaluate it based on evaluate his model based on how well it sort of captures that experience of affectivity, rather than specifically on the basis of the neurological foundation that underlies it. But yeah, so he talks about this this notion of the subconscious as being as having to do with the inter-individual, or as making possible inter-individual relations. And we'll see in a couple sections later this notion of the trans-individual, which is his account of collective individuation. But here he talks about how insofar as you can define some sort of group psychology, so if you think, I think he's thinking here of something like psychology of different nations or something like that. You can only define that at the level of affectivity, rather than at the level of either representation or action. So a group, something like a nation in general, doesn't act as one unit, or have a sort of unity of action, except for maybe some extraordinary circumstances like a war, or some sort of natural disaster that affects a whole community or something like that, where you would have you might have something like a temporary unity of action of the whole community. And then likewise, representation, or conversely, representation is something too sorry, what's the term he uses here? Too broad and too continuous. So I think the idea here is that when you look at explicit representations, there's no real difference between, I don't know, what a French person and a German person will perceive in an environment, or how they would describe a certain scenario or whatever. The level of differences between groups is at the level of affectivity, so that one group will prefer a certain type of food or a certain kind of music, whatever different cultural phenomena will have different valuations in different communities. And so that's the level where we can actually identify differences between groups. So this cultural valuation or what he's talking about here is at the inter-individual level. Uh, so the level of affectivity is a level that sort of, I don't know, leads beyond the boundaries of the individual, we can say, so that what the affectivity of an individual is not confined to that individual. It's something that sort of passes beyond the boundaries of that individual. And we'll see more on that as we continue with this chapter. And then there's this bit about pathology, which is interesting. It would be interesting to sort of look at to what extent this holds up today, I think. But the suggestion here is that any sort of brain lesion, whether it's a tumor or an injury or whatever, you you find that if it affects representation function, so if as a result of this damage to the brain, the subject has difficulty with certain types of representation, that's something that is relatively reversible. So the subject can, to some extent, learn how to adapt to that deficiency, and sort of work around it. And conversely, or likewise, in the case of action, so if a certain injury impairs the action of the subject, they can also find workarounds or other ways of adapting to the injury. But in the case where the injury affects the emotional or affective layer, Simoneau is suggesting that this is less reversible, or something that has a greater impact on personality. And like the people that like the standard example is the Phineas Gage example, where he was a railroad worker that got a tamping rod shot through his brain and somehow survived. But he apparently had like profound personality changes, so that he like people said he wasn't the same person, is sort of the wording that people used. And so any sort of impact on affectivity will tend to have a great impact on the individuality of the person, or the individuation of that person, so that there's some sort of fundamental relationship between the affective layer and individuation of a person. Just reading Pretzel's comment here. So the actual localization of the of which regions of the brain are involved in affect, I think is sort of a secondary consideration for Simondon. But it is interesting to see this as to try to compare what Simondon is saying, and based on 1950s psychology, and see to what extent that holds up today. So it might be, he might have to modify some of his when he suggests that the oldest layers of the brain are the evolutionarily oldest layers of the brain are the ones that are responsible for affectivity. That might be something we would have to modify if other areas of the brain are involved in affective regulation. Okay, let's go on to the next subsection. Let's see, this is another relatively short one, but maybe let's read a page or so and then stop and read the next bit. So if someone else would like to read.
Okay. I will read.
Okay, thank you.
Affectivity in communication and expression. Ultimately, this theory of individuating role played by the affective or emotive functions could serve as a basis for a doctrine of communication and expression. Affective or emotive instances from the basis of intersubjective communication, the reality that is called the communication of consciousnesses, could more correctly be called the communication of subconsciousness. Such a communication is established through the intermediary of participation. Neither the community of action nor the identity of the contents of consciousnesses suffice to establish intersubjective communication. This explains why intersubjective communication can be established between individuals that are very dissimilar, such as that between a human and an animal, and why very strong sympathies or antipathies can arise between very different beings. However, here beings truly exist as individuals and not as specific realities. A certain animal can be in a relation of sympathy with some other animal and not with all the animals of that same species. The profound bond between two draft animals has often been noted, a bond so strong that accidental death of one animal leads to the death of its companion. To express this relation of lived sympathy, which is at once so strong and nevertheless silent, the Greeks used, even for the human couple, the term the community of the yoke. No doubt, such an observation does not allow us to fully define what content can be transmitted in inter-individual communication, nor does it completely determine eschatological reality in advance. However, certain metaphysical consequences are inevitable. The conservation of personal identity after death does not seem possible in the simple form of continuation of existence. Spinoza's Sentimus experimerc nos eternus esse, we feel and know by experience that we are eternal, certainly corresponds to a real feeling, but the tenor of this experience is affective or emotive and should not be transposed into a representative definition or into a voluntary decision. We can neither demonstrate eternity or even conceive it, properly speaking. No wager on eternity's existence. Both would be unsatisfactory ways of reasoning that would be inadequate to their veritable object. The experience of eternity must be left at the level of what is veritably is, the basis of an affective or emotive regime. If there is a certain sort of reality that is eternal, it is the individual as a transductive being and not as a subject substance, body substance, consciousness, or active matter. Already during its objective existence, the individual, insofar as it experiences, is a being in relation. It is possible that something of the individual is eternal and is somehow reincorporated into the world with respect to which it was individual. When the individual disappears, it is annihilated only relative to its interiority. But for it to be annihilated objectively, it would have to be supposed that the milieu is also annihilated. The individual continues to exist and even to be active as an absence, or with respect to the milieu, by dying. By dying, the individual becomes an anti-individual. It changes sign, but is perpetuated in being as an absence that is still individual. The world is made up not just of actively living individuals, which are real, but also of wholes of individualities. Veritable negative individualities composed of a kernel of affectivity and emotivity existing as symbols. At the moment an individual dies, its activity is incomplete. One could say that it will remain incomplete for as long as individual beings survive that are capable of re-actualizing this active absence, the seed of consciousness and of action. The responsibility of maintaining that individuals and being through perpetual nequia, the evocation rites of the dead, depends on living individuals. The subconsciousness of living beings is fully traversed by this responsibility of maintaining in being the dead individuals that exist as absence, as the symbols with which living beings are reciprocal. Many religious dogmas have been constructed around this fundamental feeling. Religion is the domain of the trans individual. The sacred does not have its full origin in society. The sacred is fueled by the feeling of the being's perpetuity, a vacillating and precarious perpetuity with which living beings are burdened. It is fruitless to seek the origin of sacred rites as arising from a fear of the dead. Such a fear is founded on the internal feeling of lack that emerges when the living being feels that it abandons this reality of absence within it, this real symbol. The dead seem to become hostile when they are abandoned, not as dead, but as living beings of the past whose perpetuation is entrusted to prosperity. This feeling was deeply ingrained in the Romans, which is why they wanted an heir. The strong belief in substantial identity that is attached to Christian theology does not destroy this fundamental feeling. In the individual's will to serve some purpose, to do something real, and there is a certain sense that the idea that the individual cannot merely consist in itself. An absolute aseity, an absolute closure that could yield perfect eternity could not be a livable condition for the individual. To subsist would not mean to exist eternally, because this would not be to exist. The study carried out by Franz Camus in Lux Perpetua concerning the beliefs of the beyond is not just an analysis of eschatological mythology, but a veritable study of the collective or individual subconscious. Myth takes on a profound meaning here because it is not merely a representation that is useful for action or a facile mode of action. Myth can be accounted for neither through representation nor through action, because myth isn't just an uncertain representation or a procedure for acting. The source of myth is affective emotivity, and the myth is a bundle of feelings relative to the becoming of being. These feelings convey representative elements and active movements, but these realities are secondary and not essential to myth. Plato understood this value of myth, and every time the becoming of being was called into question, he made use of a myth as an adequate mode for the discovery of becoming.
Right, thanks. Yeah, I was going to stop you partway through, but I couldn't find a place that was like a good stopping point. You know, this is one of his famous giant paragraphs that continue for like 3 pages. But yeah, so this bit is I think a bit easier than the first 2 subsections. But there's a lot here as well to go into. So there's this idea. He starts with this idea of communication of consciousnesses, and so this is the phenomenon that is sometimes, I guess, thought of as being extrasensory or supernatural or something like that, but where people have this sort of profound sympathy or antipathy towards each other, and even also to animals. Uh, so anyone who has a pet, I'm sure, knows that that feeling of sort of a connection or this deep bond with the animal, um, and this is something that I mean, I've never had a horse, but I know that people who own horses and ride horses know that they have this profound connection with a horse. Yeah, and sometimes you meet an animal that you don't like for, there's no obvious reason, but you just have this antipathy towards a certain dog or cat or whatever. And he points out here that this is something that even other animals have as well. So there's this famous phenomenon or account of how draft animals, animals that are used for plowing in agriculture, if one of them dies, then the other one is affected, sometimes to the extent that it will die as well. So that there's the sort of joint action and the sympathy between these two animals is so strong that it can lead to one of them dying. And yeah, so this he goes on then from this notion of syzygy or this affective bond between individuals. He goes on to talk about what survives after death. And 61 has pointed out that this is very powerful, a very powerful passage. I think this whole section, and he talks about this line from Spinoza that I really like, where he says that we feel and know by experience that we are eternal. And of course, for Spinoza, this eternity doesn't mean like endless time. It has to do with what is outside of time or non-temporal. But Simondon takes this experience that Spinoza is describing as a real phenomenon and something to be explained. So it's not that we sort of take it at face value and say that we have like a direct experience of the eternity of the human soul or something like that. But we instead take this experience of feeling as if we're eternal. We have to understand what the basis for that experience is. And for Simondon, the basis is precisely that affective, emotive layer. So it's something that survives us after our death, so that we persist after death as an absence in someone else's life, or as he puts it here, an anti-individual. So it's almost like what was a positive sign gets turned into a negative sign in an equation, and so this this notion of surviving after our death in other people's affective understanding or affective attachment to us, I think, is a really powerful one. And I know anyone who has lost someone in their life, that that person, you feel this, like you feel their absence in a very strong way. It sort of reshapes your whole affective system or way of understanding the world and existing in the world. So it's I think this is a really good characterization of that sort of feeling of loss and of the absence of a person. And then he takes this also to be an explanation for this desire to have an heir that is so characteristic of Roman society, but is also, even today is something that people want to have a family and sort of have something that lives on after their death. And he points to the way that even though Christian theology has this doctrine of the survival of the soul as a sort of substantial identity that lives on after death, even despite that doctrine, people who live in Christian societies still have this desire for things that live on in the world of the living. So they want to, I don't know, build a monument or write a great book that will live on, or somehow affect other people's lives in such a way that you have that you live on after your death in those people's lives. And he also, I think, makes an interesting point. Sorry, I'm going a little bit out of order here, but going back up the page, he makes the point that trying to explain religion as being the result of a fear of the dead is sort of getting things backwards, because it doesn't explain why people should fear the dead at all in the first place. And for Simondon, this fear of the dead arises through this feeling of abandoning the dead, right? So because the dead live on in us, insofar as we sort of keep them alive, there's always this possibility that we are not keeping them alive, or not to the extent that maybe they would have wanted. So then there's this feeling of abandoning the dead and not allowing them to live on in a full sense of that term. And it's because of that, it's only because of that abandonment that we fear the dead and fear their judgment of us. So yeah, this explanation of religion from fear of the dead, which I think was like a one of the sort of widespread theories of the origin of religion in like 19th century anthropology. It sort of gets things backwards, because it takes as the cause what is really the effect. And then so he argues that it's only because as individuals we have this connection with others, that we aren't sort of self-subsisting independent entities. It's only because of that we have anything like a life after death. So it's because we have this affective communication with others that we live on in other people's affectivity after our death. And so if the individual were something like a complete self-contained substance, then that individual would just disappear after death. There would be nothing left. And then there's the last bit here where he talks about Plato, and so Plato has these sort of strange passages where he says, let's introduce a myth, or let's create a new myth, or something like that, which is sort of a strange thing to say. But he introduces these myths in the Republic, in the Phaedo. I forget which other ones, but there's a few different texts where he, in the Symposium, of course, yeah, so he introduces these myths that there's something like, Plato of course has this suspicion of poetry, and in the Republic, he bans the poets from his ideal city, um, but he at the same time he recognizes the power of the poetic and of myth and storytelling, and so Simondon argues here that Plato uses myth, or suggests here that Plato uses myth as a way to express becoming, or specifically the becoming of being. So, um, and we see this especially in the Timaeus, which is, the whole thing is one giant myth of creation, and at the outset of the dialogue, the discussants basically agree that a myth or a story is the best you can do for talking about the realm of becoming. Whereas in the realm of being, you can have certain knowledge. When you're talking about becoming, the best you can have is a probable story. Um, and so, myth or story is what corresponds to becoming. So the next section is a bit longer, and as I suggested at the outset today, I wouldn't mind ending a bit early. So maybe we can take any like final questions or comments here, and then pick up subsection 4 for next time.
That sounds good to me. I'll definitely make it for next time, given the content so far. This is almost spellbinding. I couldn't really miss it. I'd feel terrible.
Yeah, this is one of the I think one of the most interesting parts of this book, and it's a bit strange that when he published the book, the original publication of the book was just the first two parts, and so this part wasn't published until the year of his death. I'm not sure if it actually was published before or after his death, but it was several decades later. So this part for 25, 30 years just sort of sat in his desk or whatever, with no one really knowing about it except for, I guess, his committee. So yeah, it was kind of surprising that some of the strongest passages of this book, he just decided not to publish them at that time.
Can I ask you a question about the Simondon's later years? Do you know anything around that topic? I found it very hard to find even like just basic historical information about his later life, and I don't know why I have been running into a brick wall.
Yeah, there's not a lot available about his biography, which is kind of surprising. Like he, of course, in the 20th century figures, we expect a lot of information to be available. And I know his daughter is involved in the publication of his works. Um, um, so, like, you would think she would have a lot of information about his life. But no, I don't really know a lot about his later biography. I'm not like he did teach at I forget where at university anyway, but he was teaching for a while at least, but I'm not sure how long he kept doing that.
It seems almost like there's a lack of finality, just like that minor historical detail, perhaps. But it's always driven me a little crazy that I can't find more information about him in this time period of his life.
Yeah, maybe one of us will have to write the definitive biography, dig through whatever archival documents are available, and so on.
Right, or maybe do interviews.
Yeah, like a lot of these people are still alive, like his daughter and other people that were involved in his life are still alive. This wasn't sort of ancient history. He died in 1989, if I remember correctly. So yeah, so this information is out there somewhere or in someone's head. It's just not like in an accessible place or gathered together. Okay, so if there's any other comments, maybe, or if there are no other comments, then we can end here. Okay, cool. Yeah, let's end here. And we'll pick up from subsection 4 next time. And there's more on life after death and or the relationship between life and death and the trans individual, which is one of his key concepts that we've seen like little hints of before, but now we're getting into more of the actual development of this concept. So stay tuned. Okay, bye.